Ashford had always been a place that felt untouched, like a snapshot of simpler times, where life moved slowly, almost too slowly. The kind of town where the only excitement came from an occasional storm or the annual fair. It was a place I had come to appreciate over the 2 years I'd lived here, especially after years spent chasing the chaos of the city. I had thought Ashford's predictability was a blessing. Nothing ever really changed. The same faces, the same streets, the same quiet, familiar rhythm. That is, until the day everything shifted. It was late afternoon when I first noticed it. I had just wrapped up a routine check-in at the precinct, my body heavy with exhaustion from yet another monotonous day. The cold wind bit at the back of my neck as I adjusted my jacket. Then, out of the corner of my eye, something stopped me dead in my tracks. A sign. Not just any sign. This one was old-fashioned, wooden, hanging crookedly from a wrought iron bracket. "The Clockmaker," it read, in faded gold letters. I had walked down this street 100 times. I knew every corner, every shop, every creaky sign. But this was new. The sign hadn't been there that morning. It had appeared overnight, as if it had been waiting for me. I turned to Max, who had been walking beside me. He didn't seem to notice the sign at first. Max was the type of guy who didn't let small oddities bother him. If anything, he found them amusing. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice tight. Max glanced up, a frown furrowing his brow. He stepped closer, squinting at the sign through the mist that had started to settle over Ashford. "I didn't notice it this morning," he said. "Is that supposed to be here?" I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. My instincts, honed by years of investigating crimes, were on edge. The air had shifted somehow, as if something was watching us. "It looks like an antique shop," Max mused, stepping closer to the door, which hung slightly ajar, creaking in the wind. "Let's check it out." I hesitated. I wasn't the kind of guy to indulge in curiosity for curiosity's sake, but something about this shop felt wrong, like a wrong note in an otherwise perfect melody. Still, I couldn't ignore it. My feet moved, almost on their own, toward the door. The moment we stepped inside, the temperature dropped. The air was thick with the musty scent of dust and age. The shop was a labyrinth of old timepieces, grandfather clocks, pocket watches, mantel clocks, each one ticking in unison, their rhythmic sound vibrating in my chest. It was maddening, oppressive. The man behind the counter was tall, too tall. His features were sharp, almost too perfect, and his eyes, dark and unblinking, followed us with an unsettling intensity. There was something ancient about him, something far older than the town itself. His gaze felt like it could see through to your soul. "Welcome," he said, his voice like the creak of old floorboards. "I've been expecting you." A chill ran down my spine. My hand twitched toward my holster, but I didn't draw. There was something wrong about this place, something that felt like it was bending reality around us. "I sell time," the Clockmaker continued, his smile not reaching his eyes. "More specifically, the moment of death." I could feel Max's skepticism. "What do you mean? Are these some kind of novelty?" The Clockmaker's smile widened, revealing teeth far too sharp. "Not a novelty, detective, a gift, for those who wish to know when their time will come." My heart rate spiked. I felt the temperature drop further, the weight of his words pressing down on me. I could almost feel the seconds ticking by, each one dragging us closer to something terrible. "I'd advise you to leave," the Clockmaker said, his voice dropping into something darker, something deeper. "Before it's too late." Then the door slammed open. A woman entered, her face pale and drawn with grief. She clutched something tightly in her hands, her eyes locking onto the clockmaker's. There was desperation in her gaze, a quiet, pleading terror that made my pulse quicken. The clockmaker smiled again, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. It's never too late, for some. And then, just as quickly as she had entered, the door slammed shut behind her, leaving us in the silence of that cursed shop. Something had changed. I didn't know what it was, but I knew, deep down, that Ashford's peaceful facade had shattered. And now, like a clock winding down, there was no stopping what was to come. The air in the shop felt dense, almost suffocating. It was as if time itself was trapped here, pressing down on me with the weight of countless secrets. The constant ticking of the clocks, hundreds, maybe more, reverberated through my bones. Each tick, a second lost, each second, a moment that could never be reclaimed. It was maddening, relentless. And yet, there was something almost magnetic about it, a pull that I couldn't resist. I glanced over at Max, standing a few paces away, his eyes scanning the shelves with a curiosity that bordered on fascination. Max had always been the more open-minded one, willing to entertain the strange and unexplained. Me? I wasn't so quick to indulge. But even I couldn't ignore the eerie presence of this place, or the unsettling figure behind the counter. The clockmaker stood there like a sentinel of time itself. His eyes, dark, deep pools of black, seemed to reflect the endless ticking that surrounded us. It was as if he could read our thoughts, see the questions swirling just beneath the surface. His gaze followed us, unblinking, like a predator watching its prey. I cleared my throat, trying to shake off the growing unease. "What is this place?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. The clockmaker didn't answer right away. He moved with an unnerving grace, as if he had all the time in the world, reaching for a small pocket watch that had been sitting on the counter. The silver gleamed in the dim light, the intricate engravings catching the faint glow from the lamp above. "This," he said, his voice low, almost a hum, "is not just a shop. It is a place where time can be controlled." I frowned, a chill creeping down my spine. There was something about the way he spoke, a sense of foreboding that made his words feel more like a threat than a mere offer. Max, sensing the tension, stepped closer to the counter, leaning forward. "Controlled?" he repeated, his voice laced with skepticism. "Time's not something you can control. It just happens." The clockmaker's lips curled into a slow, deliberate smile, as if he were savoring the moment. "Ah, but that is where you are wrong. Time is not a river, flowing relentlessly in one direction. Time is a force, a thing, and it can be shaped, twisted, turned to one's will." I could feel my stomach tighten. "What exactly are you selling here?" I demanded, my voice more forceful now. The clockmaker didn't flinch. He placed the pocket watch down slowly, the ticking growing louder than the others. "I offer a gift," he said, his voice softening, almost coaxing. A clock that will show you the precise moment of your death." The words hung in the air, thick and heavy, like smoke curling around us. My heart skipped a beat. I couldn't breathe. Max's eyes widened, disbelief painted on his face. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice rising. "You can't be serious. No one can know when they're going to die." The clockmaker's eyes gleamed, a flicker of something dark flashing through them. "Ah, but that's where you are wrong again. It's not a matter of belief or science. The clock doesn't lie. It doesn't predict. It reveals the truth. It shows the moment that fate has already chosen for you." My pulse quickened. "This is madness," I muttered, more to myself than to him. "Is it?" The clockmaker's voice was cool, dismissive. Everyone is bound by time. Everyone has their moment, and I offer you the knowledge of it before it happens." His smile widened, colder now. For some, the knowledge is a burden, a fear that grows and gnaws at them until their time finally comes. But for others, it is a gift, an opportunity to prepare, to understand the inevitable. I shook my head, my mind racing, trying to make sense of this. This wasn't just a man selling clocks. This was something else. Something darker, something ancient. I could feel it deep in my gut, gnawing at me, telling me this place was far more than it appeared. Max, ever the one to push boundaries, stepped forward. "Why would anyone want a clock like that?" he asked, his voice quieter now, like the idea was already starting to take root in his mind. The clockmaker's smile grew, sharper now, predatory. "Some people want to know. Some people want to prepare, and others want to know when they will finally be free." The words slithered into my thoughts, slow poison working its way through my brain. The air felt heavier, the ticking of the clocks pressing against my skull like 1,000 tiny needles. I tried to shake it off, but it was like trying to escape a nightmare that wouldn't let go. "What do you want from us?" I demanded, my voice cracking, trying to regain some semblance of control. The clockmaker didn't answer right away. He reached behind the counter, his fingers brushing over the old clocks, each movement delicate, practiced, as if he had done it 1,000 times before. Finally, he pulled out a small, ornate clock, its tarnished silver frame glinting in the dim light, its intricate carvings shifting and changing when I wasn't looking directly at them. "This," he whispered, "is what I offer. A clock for each of you. It will show you the exact moment of your death." The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. The clock in his hands seemed to pulse with a dark, hypnotic energy. I wanted to step back. I wanted to run. But something kept me rooted to the spot. A part of me, the part that had seen too much in my career, was drawn to the mystery of it all, to the unexplainable nature of what was happening. Max, ever the curious one, reached forward, his fingers brushing against the cold surface of the clock. The moment his skin made contact, the air shifted. The clocks around us began to tick faster, louder, as if time itself was speeding up, closing in around us. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, a deep, unsettling sense of dread. I wanted to leave. I needed to leave. But something told me that once we stepped into this world, once we touched the clockmaker's cursed clocks, there would be no turning back. "You've made your choice," the clockmaker murmured, his voice a whisper that seemed to seep into my very bones. The clock in Max's hand ticked faster, its hands spinning out of control. And in that moment I knew, whatever this was, whatever dark force the clockmaker had unleashed, we were already too far gone. The town of Ashford had fallen into an eerie stillness, the kind that makes you feel like the world is holding its breath. The usual sounds, the hum of late-night traffic, the soft murmur of distant conversations, were gone. Even the wind had ceased, as if nature itself understood that something had shifted in the air, something that couldn't be undone. I stood in my small, dimly lit office at the precinct, staring at the open file on my desk. My mind was a mess, tangled in thoughts, but most of them kept circling back to that damn shop. The clockmaker. Something about that place felt wrong, unnatural, as if it had pulled me into a story I couldn't understand, a story I couldn't escape. Max was pacing, boots clicking on the wooden floor in an almost rhythmic frustration. "This is insane, Liam," he muttered, throwing his coat onto a chair. "A shop that appears out of nowhere. A clockmaker who says he can tell you the moment you're going to die. How is that even possible?" I didn't answer right away. I was still thinking about the clock, the one Max had touched. The moment his skin made contact, it had pulsed with a cold, unnatural energy. The ticking from that shop had lodged itself in my mind, echoing louder than it had in the shop itself, drowning out everything else. All I could hear was that incessant ticking, relentless and maddening. "Maybe we should go back," Max added, his voice softening with a hint of uncertainty. "Maybe we're not seeing the full picture." "Back?" I looked up, narrowing my eyes at him. "You want to go back to that place? After everything we saw? That thing is playing with people's lives, Max. We can't just ignore it." Before he could respond, the shrill sound of the police radio cut through the tension. I grabbed it, the words barely registering before my heart skipped a beat. "Unit 3, we've got a situation at the Everly Apartments. A woman, found dead, possible foul play, requesting immediate backup." The name froze me in place. Emily. My mind raced, the Everly Apartments just a few blocks away. But it wasn't the location that sent the chill down my spine. It was the name. Emily Winters. I stood abruptly, the chair scraping harshly against the floor. Max was already moving toward the door, knowing there was no time to waste. When we arrived, the scene before us seemed unreal, like something pulled from a nightmare. The building was shrouded in darkness, the flickering lights from the street lamps casting jagged shadows that stretched across the pavement. Officers were already there, their faces grim, their bodies tense. The air felt thick, heavy with something unspoken. I approached the door, flashing my badge. The officer on duty stepped aside, eyes downcast. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice steady despite the unease creeping up my spine. "She's in there," the officer replied, his voice tight. "Emily Winters. Found her an hour ago. No signs of trauma, nothing unusual, but—" "Her face, detective, her face." I didn't need to hear more. I motioned for Max to follow me as I pushed open the door. Inside, the apartment was disturbingly normal. Modest furniture, scattered papers, a half-finished cup of tea on the coffee table. But what hit me first was the smell. It was sharp, metallic, like the taste of copper on the tongue, mingled with something sweet, something sickly. And there, on the floor in the middle of the room, lay Emily Winters. Her body was unnaturally still, her hands folded neatly at her sides. Her eyes were wide open, locked in an expression of pure terror. The kind of fear I had seen before, on the faces of people who had witnessed something so terrible, so incomprehensible it broke them. But what truly stopped me in my tracks was the clock. It lay beside her, gleaming in the dim light. The hands were frozen in place, no ticking, no movement. It was the clock, the one from the shop, the one Max had touched. My heart skipped a beat. No, it can't be. I crouched beside Emily's body, my fingers brushing the cold, lifeless skin. Her eyes stared, wide and glassy. There was something in the way they looked, like she wasn't seeing me, but something beyond the walls of this room, something far beyond this world. Her mouth was slightly open, frozen in a scream she never had the chance to release. I checked her pulse, but there was nothing. The terror was still there, thick in the air around us, hanging like a curse. Max leaned over, his eyes fixed on the clock. "This doesn't make sense. If it wasn't natural, then what?" "She was afraid," I cut him off, standing up quickly. My mind was reeling. This doesn't look like a natural death. It looks like she died from the terror. That clock, it did this. The Clockmaker did this. Max's face had gone pale, but he didn't argue. He knew it, just as I did. Something far darker was at play here, something we hadn't fully understood yet. Her clock, It's the same one from the shop, I said, my voice tight. It's the moment, her moment. Max swallowed hard, his expression drawn. You mean it said she would die tonight? I nodded grimly, and it came true. The silence in the room was suffocating, surreal. The life that had once filled this apartment was gone, replaced by an oppressive, unbearable quiet. The only sound was the faint, eerie ticking of clocks from the hallway, their rhythm unyielding and cold. Time had not stopped. The clockmaker's influence had not stopped. We need to go back, I said, my voice low, a chill settling in my bones. We need to confront him. Before we could leave, another officer approached, his face pale with disbelief. Detective, he said, voice trembling, you should see this. My stomach twisted. Something was wrong. Something was shifting, and I felt it in my gut. I followed the officer into the hallway where another officer stood, staring at the wall in shock. There's a clock, the officer said, his voice shaky. In the hallway, it's ticking. It shouldn't be. I turned toward the wall where the officer was pointing. A brass wall clock hung above the doorframe, its hands spinning wildly, faster than natural. It was wrong. It was all wrong. I reached for the clock, my fingers brushing the glass. The moment I touched it, the ticking stopped. The hands froze with a final, sharp click. My breath caught in my throat. It had stopped. The moment had ended. But deep down, I knew Emily's death wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. And the worst part? No matter how fast the hands of the clock spun, no matter how much I tried to outrun it, I knew the next tick was coming for me. And I couldn't escape it. Ashford was no longer still. It had become a place trapped in a relentless cycle of time, where every second ticked down toward something darker. And no one was safe. I couldn't shake the feeling that the air around me had thickened since we left the Everly apartments. The weight of the night seemed to press down on me, suffocating me, as if the very fabric of reality had begun to warp. Emily Winter's death wasn't just another tragedy. No, this felt different, deeper, darker. I could feel it in my bones. This wasn't just a case. This was something else. Something that had reached into Ashford and claimed its first victim. The drive back to the precinct was silent. Max's eyes never strayed from the road, but I could feel the tension radiating from him. Neither of us spoke, lost in our own thoughts. We both knew what we had seen, how the terror had been carved into Emily's face, how the clock beside her body had refused to stop, even after her last breath. By the time we reached the precinct, it was past midnight. Ashford's streets, usually full of life, were now bathed in an eerie stillness. The shadows stretched long and twisted under the streetlights, and the town felt like a ghost town, frozen in time, teetering on the edge of something unseen, something inevitable. My mind raced as I pushed open the door to the precinct. I sat at my desk, staring at the open file in front of me. The Clockmaker. I had to know more. I had to understand what kind of force we were dealing with here. Max was pacing, his boots echoing in the quiet room. "I don't get it, Liam," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. "This can't be real. A clock that predicts your death? No one can explain that away." I didn't answer right away. My eyes were on the file, the one containing everything we knew about Emily. It was thin, just a few sheets of paper. There was nothing unusual about her life. No history of mental illness, no enemies, no reason for her to be caught up in this madness. Then, something caught my eye. A name. An address listed under Last Known Contact. It was in the oldest part of Ashford, near the outskirts of town. I'd passed by it dozens of times, but now that address felt like a beacon. an anchor to something dark, something dangerous. This wasn't a coincidence. There was a connection between this place and the Clockmaker. I was sure of it. I stood up abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Max," I said, my voice steady but filled with urgency. "We need to go to this address. Now." The drive to the old part of town was slow, the streets growing narrower and more desolate as we left the center of Ashford behind. The streetlights flickered, casting long, jagged shadows across the buildings, which looked like they had been forgotten by time itself. Crumbling facades, boarded-up windows, the air thick with neglect. This place felt like it was suspended in another era, a place that time had abandoned. When we reached the end of the street, there it was, a weather-beaten house at the corner. It looked more like a ruin than a home. Its roof sagged under the weight of years of neglect, its windows dark, and the number on the mailbox barely legible. "This is it," I said quietly, almost to myself. Max looked at me, uncertainty in his eyes. "Are you sure about this? We don't even know who lives here. What if we're chasing ghosts?" I didn't answer. I stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching under my boots. Max hesitated for a moment, then followed, his reluctance clear. The door to the house was ajar, as if waiting for us, and the air around us felt heavy, like something had been waiting for this moment for far too long. I pushed the door open, the hinges creaking loudly in the silence, cutting through the stillness like a scream in the dark. Inside, the house was a maze of dust and decay. The floorboards groaned beneath our feet, and the smell of must, old paper, and rotting wood filled the air. The darkness here felt alive, suffocating, pressing in on us from all sides. The further we went into the house, the more oppressive the air became. There was something here, an energy, that seemed to hang in the corners, whispering secrets I wasn't meant to hear. We came upon a small room at the back of the house. The door was slightly ajar, and through the crack I saw the faintest flicker of light. I pushed it open, and we stepped inside. The room was dimly lit by a single candle burning on a wooden table. But it wasn't the candle that caught my attention. It was the wall. The entire wall was covered in clocks. Some were old, some newer, but all of them ticked in unison, their sound filling the room like the heartbeat of something ancient and malevolent. But it wasn't the clocks that froze me in place. It was the photographs. Scattered across the table and pinned to the wall were dozens of the photographs. Some in black and white, others in color. All of them had one thing in common. Each person was standing in front of a clock. Their faces were familiar, people from Ashford. Some were smiling, others looked nervous, even fearful. But each photograph featured the same clock, the Clockmaker's clock. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just a shop. This wasn't some eccentric man with a passion for time. This was something far worse, something ancient. The Clockmaker wasn't just predicting death. He was orchestrating it. These people, these victims, they had all come into contact with him. They had all been chosen. Their lives had been nothing more than pieces in his game, moved at his will. My heart pounded in my chest. "This is it, Max," I whispered. "He's been doing this for years. This is how he grows stronger. These people, they're all connected." Max stepped forward, his face pale. "But how? How is he doing this? How is he controlling time?" I scanned the photographs, my eyes lingering on one in particular. Emily's face staring back at me, her eyes wide with terror. Her death hadn't been an accident, it had been planned. The candles flickered, casting shadows along the walls. A sudden, overwhelming dread settled over me. We were standing in the very heart of the Clockmaker's power, a place where fate was twisted, manipulated by a force beyond understanding. I turned to Max, my voice low but filled with resolve. We need to destroy this. We need to stop him before more people die. But as I spoke, a cold breeze swept through the room, extinguishing the candle in a single gust. In the darkness, I heard it. The sound of clocks ticking faster, louder. It was as if time itself was counting down to something terrible. And then, just as the last breath of air left my lungs, I heard it. A voice, soft and distant, echoing through the room. You shouldn't have come here, detective. My skin crawled as I turned toward the doorway. There, standing in the shadows, was the Clockmaker. His figure stretched across the room like an omen, and in his hand he held a clock, its hands spinning wildly. It was too late. The final game had begun. The moment the Clockmaker's voice echoed through the dark room, everything else seemed to fade into a suffocating silence. The clocks on the walls, once ticking in unison, now pulsed with an unnatural rhythm, faster and louder, like the heartbeat of something ancient, something evil. The air thickened, the shadows stretching unnaturally, reaching toward us like cold, insistent fingers. My heart raced, my pulse pounded in my ears, every instinct in my body screamed for me to run, to get out of this cursed house before it swallowed us whole. But my feet were rooted to the spot, as though the very floorboards had become part of the trap, binding me here, forcing me to face whatever was coming. The Clockmaker's smile grew, but it wasn't one of warmth or kindness. It was the grin of a predator, one who had waited far longer than I could comprehend for this moment. "You've found me," he murmured, his voice like velvet, smooth and chilling. "And now, it's too late." Max stepped forward, his body rigid, his eyes darting between the Clockmaker and the clocks that seemed to close in around us. "You've killed her, haven't you?" Max's voice trembled, but there was a steady resolve beneath it. "You've been killing everyone who touches your damn clocks." The Clockmaker didn't flinch. His smile never wavered. "I don't kill. I simply show them the truth of their time. The moment they cannot escape. The truth of their time." It wasn't just fate he was toying with. No, the Clockmaker was something older than any human mind could comprehend. He wasn't just predicting death, he was manipulating time itself. He was an entity that existed outside the linear boundaries of mortality. My gaze flicked to the photographs scattered across the table, the faces of people who had all been pulled into the Clockmaker's web. I looked back at him, this tall, gaunt figure who stood before us, his frail hands clutching a clock like a weapon, ready to strike. "How many more, Clockmaker?" I growled, barely able to suppress the rage simmering beneath my words. "How many more will you steal from this town? How many will you lead to their deaths?" His eyes gleamed, his smile unwavering. "You think you can stop me? Time is not a simple thing. It cannot be unraveled by mere mortals. You think you understand it, detective, but you don't. You cannot. You cannot control it. And you cannot defeat it." Max's hand hovered near his sidearm, but I could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on us. This wasn't about guns or violence. This was about something darker, something far beyond our comprehension. "You are nothing but a parasite," I spat, stepping forward, my eyes never leaving the Clockmaker. "You feed on their fear, their grief. You twist them into something they were never meant to be." The Clockmaker chuckled softly, the sound smooth and unsettling. "Fear, grief, despair, these are the currencies of time. Every death, every moment of suffering strengthens me, and with each one I grow more powerful." My chest tightened, and my fingers itched for the gun I knew would do nothing against this malevolent force. "Then you've already lost," I said through gritted teeth. because I'm not afraid of you." His eyes darkened, the smile faltering briefly before it returned. Colder, sharper. "You think you can defeat me by denying fear? You are a fool, detective. Your death was already written the moment you stepped into my shop." My heart skipped a beat, and I glanced at Max. His face had gone pale. We both knew, deep down, this wasn't going to end with a simple arrest. There were forces at play here that no man, no gun, no logic could challenge. The clockmaker stepped closer, his movement slow and deliberate, as though savoring the moment. The air around him seemed to hum with power, the ticking of the clocks growing louder with each passing second. His presence felt almost oppressive, like reality itself was bending around him. "You've seen it, haven't you?" the clockmaker whispered, his voice rasping now. "You've felt it, the pull of time, the certainty that it will consume you. You cannot escape it." I could feel it now, deep within my chest, the inexorable pull of time, the weight of inevitability. The clock I had seen, the one hanging in the shop, the one that had ticked faster and faster, counting down the moments to my own death, it had always been there, a shadow waiting to engulf me. But I refused to give in. I couldn't let this thing, this abomination, claim any more souls. With a sudden, violent movement, I lunged forward, grabbing the clock from the clockmaker's hands before he could stop me. For a moment, time itself seemed to still, the hands of the clock frozen mid-tick. The air around us crackled with energy, and the clocks in the room all halted their rhythmic chorus. The clockmaker's expression twisted with rage, his eyes widening. "You fool!" he screamed. "You cannot stop time. You cannot!" But I wasn't listening. With a guttural roar, I hurled the clock to the floor, shattering it into pieces. The sound of glass and metal cracking reverberated through the room, and for a heartbeat, it seemed like the entire world had frozen. The clocks, one by one, fell silent. For a fleeting moment, I thought it was over, that we had won. But then the ground trembled beneath us, and the walls pulsed with an unnatural force. The room twisted, the very fabric of reality distorting, bending like a nightmare. The clockmaker's form began to shimmer and shift, his body warping like smoke in the wind. "You think you've won?" he hissed, his voice now a guttural rasp. "You cannot defeat me. I am not bound by your mortal constraints. I am time itself." I staggered backward, Max grabbing my arm to steady me. The air was thick with an oppressive force, as if the very essence of time was collapsing inward. "You may have broken my clock," the clockmaker continued, his form flickering between human and something far darker. "But time is a cycle, a circle, and you cannot escape it." My breath came in shallow gasps as I tried to steady myself. There was only one way to end this, to sever the clockmaker's connection to the source of his power. And it wasn't going to be easy. With a sharp, determined look at Max, I nodded. We knew what we had to do. "Now, Max," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the rising chaos, "we destroy the source." Max pulled away, his eyes grim but resolute. Together, we made our way to the center of the room, toward the altar, the heart of the clockmaker's twisted domain. It was a place of power, a place where time was bent and broken, where every clock had been tied to the clockmaker's will. I felt the power in the air, the pulse of it beneath my skin. I knew we had one chance, one moment to sever the connection, and I couldn't let it slip away. With all my strength, I reached out and tore at the altar, pulling apart the heart of the clockmaker's power. The room screamed with the sound of grinding metal, of time itself being twisted and ripped apart. The clockmaker howled in fury as the room around us began to implode. But as the final piece of the clock shattered, the air went still. For one brief, impossible moment, Everything stopped. And in that silence, I knew the battle was over. But at what cost? The world around me seemed to pulse, each second stretching into eternity. The room blurred into fractured shadows and light, the very air vibrating with a resonance that felt beyond my understanding. It was as if time itself had splintered, shattered into a million jagged pieces, and I was standing at the center of it all, an unstable thread holding everything together. The clocks had stopped. It should have been the moment of victory, the moment Max and I had fought for. The altar had fallen, and the oppressive force that had filled the room was slowly dissipating, leaving only an eerie stillness behind. We had shattered the source of the Clockmaker's power, but even in this silence I could feel it. Time. It hadn't gone. Not truly. It had merely been delayed, like a ticking bomb wound too tight. The air around us was still, but the pressure was building again. I could feel it creeping in from all sides, the weight of it pressing through the cracks in the room, seeping through my bones. There was no escaping it. Max's hand gripped my arm, his voice frantic and hoarse. "Liam, we did it. It's over. Right?" I didn't answer. My gaze was fixed on the spot where the Clockmaker had stood just moments before. Now, there was nothing but the warped, flickering remnants of his presence. The air still crackled with unnatural energy, and the walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting, warping and twisting. But then my eyes were drawn to something, a clock. Small, ornate, almost unassuming. It lay amid the shattered pieces of the Clockmaker's most powerful clock, and it was ticking again. Slowly at first, but unmistakably the hands were moving. My stomach dropped. The realization hit me like a slap across the face, a cold chill wrapping itself around my heart. I hadn't destroyed it. I hadn't severed the last thread that connected me to the Clockmaker. My clock. The one I had seen hanging in the shop. The one that had started ticking faster and faster after I touched it. It had always been there, lurking, counting down to this moment. The hands were moving, ticking down, counting the final moments. "Max," I whispered, my voice shaking, barely audible over the silence that seemed to choke the room. "It's not over. I can feel it. This is it." Max turned toward me, confusion and fear etched across his face. "What do you mean?" "We stopped him, Liam. We stopped all of this." But I could already see it, the truth creeping up on me. The clock was moving, and it was my clock, the one that had been counting down ever since I entered the Clockmaker's shop. The room felt like it was closing in on us, the shadows creeping closer. The ticking of the clock filled the air, louder now, more insistent, as if mocking us, as if it had always known, as if it had always been in control. Max's voice cut through the tension, raw with panic. "Liam, no, don't do this. Don't tell me. Your clock." But I didn't need to hear the words. I had known since the moment I touched that damned clock, since I first felt the cold pulse of it in my chest. I had known. This was the price. The clock had already started. The hands had begun to move, ticking away the final seconds. "Max, you don't understand," I said, my voice steady now, but hollow. "It's been here all along, his power. It's tied to time itself. And now it's too late. The clock is ticking and I can't stop it." Max's eyes widened, disbelief spreading across his face. "You're telling me this is it? I grabbed his arm, my grip tight. "I've seen it. I've felt it. The moment we entered the shop, I was already part of it, part of his game. This clock, it's the last thread. The moment it finishes ticking, so do I." The ticking of the clock grew louder, each sound reverberating in my bones, as if each tick were a piece of my life, slowly being stolen from me. Max shook his head, desperation in his voice. "No, Liam, no, we're not doing this. You can't just accept it. We can fight this." I wanted to comfort him. I wanted to say something to make him feel better, but the words stuck in my throat. I had seen what happened to the others. I had watched as the Clockmaker fed on their fear, watched as the ticking devoured them from the inside out. I knew what would happen when the clock reached its final moment. There would be no fight, no escape. Time would come for me, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. The final tick echoed through the room, deep and final, and with it, the world around us froze. Everything was held in place by the power of time itself. The air thickened, heavy with the sensation of something coming to an end. I felt it first, a coldness spreading from my chest, radiating outward. It wasn't pain, not exactly, it was absence, a hollowing out of my very being. My heart stuttered, but it wasn't my heartbeat anymore. It was the rhythm of time, marking my end. Max screamed my name, but the sound was distant, muffled, as if it were coming from far away. I couldn't answer. I couldn't do anything. And then, everything shattered. The room exploded with light and sound, a cacophony of clocks and their endless ticking. Reality tore apart at the edges, unraveling like a fraying thread. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. I was suspended in a moment that had no beginning or end. Time itself had become a blur, a distorted, broken thing. But amidst the chaos, I saw him, the Clockmaker. His form was no longer human, no longer bound by shape or limitation. He was a shadow, an entity of pure malevolence, swirling in the remnants of the collapsing world. In that moment I understood. The Clockmaker was not just a man. He was a force, a creature born of time itself, a predator that had lived for centuries, devouring those who dared to challenge him. He was time's cruel inevitability, and now I was part of it. In my final moments I reached out, but there was no way to stop it, no way to reverse the pull of time. I could feel my breath slipping away, my vision narrowing as the endless ticking consumed me. And then there was nothing. Time had taken me. And in that silence, in that final, eternal moment, the clocks stopped.